The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Fundamentals, Big Ideas from the National Core Arts Standards and Guiding Principles for Students with Disabilities. I'm Lisa D'Amico, your moderator and webinar organizer. Today's webinar is part of a monthly series that comes out of the Office of VSA and Accessibility at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. This series addresses topics related to arts, disability, and education. If you would like to view live stream captioning of the webinar, you can follow the link you see on the slide and in the chat box of the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Before we get started, let's take a moment to ensure that you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel on the right side of your screen. This control panel can be hidden by clicking on the orange arrow in the top left corner. If you need to leave the webinar early, you can exit out of the program by clicking on the X in the upper right corner. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so you can catch up on any parts you miss. Make sure that you have selected telephone or mic and speakers to correspond with how you're connected to the webinar. You have the ability to submit or answer questions, which is especially encouraged in this webinar, using the chat pane located near the bottom of the control panel. We're also going to be doing a couple of different chats, so everyone is encouraged to answer the questions that we'll put out to the audience. If you would prefer to say the question instead of typing it, you can click on the raise your hand icon on the control panel and I will unmute your microphone. Your questions will come directly to me, and during the designated question and answer time at the end of the presentation, I'll relay them to our presenters. I want to emphasize that following the presentation, I will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's presentation, a copy of the PowerPoint, a helpful handout, and a copy of the transcript. This means you don't need to worry about frantically taking notes during the presentation. You can always go back and watch the recording and review the supplemental materials. If you're active in social media, I invite you to connect with us using the hashtag VSAWebinar. And Zoe, our social media intern for the summer, I'm taking advantage of her being here. She will be live tweeting on Twitter during the webinar. So if you're a Twitter user, I encourage you to pop on there and tweet back at her. Oop. So you can join us also on Facebook at VSA International, Twitter at VSAINTL, Instagram at VSA International. And with that, I will turn it over to today's presenters who are presenting on behalf of the Arts Alliance of Northern New Hampshire, Dr. Sharon Malley and Marcia McCaffrey.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Sharon and I are very pleased to be here this afternoon on the VSA International webinar. And for us to get started, I am looking, Lisa, for how I do the, here we go. So let me pull up the PowerPoint we have for today.
So you're looking for me to get my act together and send you the request.
So welcome to Fundamentals, Big Ideas from the National Core Arts Standards and Guiding Principles for Teachers of Students with Disabilities. My name is Marcia McCaffrey. I'm from the New Hampshire State Department of Education, and I'm currently the president of the State Education Agency Directors of Arts Education. And joining me today is Sharon Malley. Sharon, would you like to say hello?
Yes. Hi, I'm Sharon Malley, and I'm an arts and special education consultant, and I'm located in Arlington, Virginia, and I've worked with VSA on a number of initiatives. I'm happy to be here.
And Sharon's going to tell us a little bit more about what to expect during today's session.
Okay, so we are going to provide an overview of the National Core Arts Standards, incorporate elements of the website, which is the nationalartsstandards.org, bridge principles and practices that are fundamental to working with students with disabilities in arts education to the core arts standards, and examine how the standards support arts learning for all students. So the National Core Arts Standards is a process that guides educators in providing a unified quality arts education for students in pre-K through high school. So the core art standards identify what is important for students to know and be able to do in the artistic disciplines of dance, media arts, music, theater, and visual arts. They identify pathways for students to become creative thinkers, creative makers, and creative responders to the world around them. They emphasize the collaborative nature of artistic production and reaffirm the importance of a comprehensive education that extends beyond reading and math.
10 national organizations spent 3 years designing and writing these new national voluntary arts standards. The writers and the leadership team came together in person, but most of the work was done virtually, actually over a system similar to this through WebEx for virtual meetings that occurred over this length of time. Here's a list of the national organizations that were part of the leadership team. When you look at the list, you'll see many common and recognizable organizations related to arts education. And you'll see a few of our unexpected partners in this work. The team listed here is also known as the Coalition, and I'd like to point out that our 2 partner organizations as well, the Kennedy Center and also Lincoln Center. So some of those usual suspects that you'll see include the National Association for Music Education, the National Art Education Association, and also my organization down there on the bottom left, the State Education Agency Directors of Arts Education, representing state departments of education. Some of those unexpected players that you might see in the list could include Americans for the Arts, Young Audiences for Arts Learning, and the College Board. And these organizations, of course, weren't involved in prior standards development, so we were happy to have them come on board with the leadership team. The Coalition drove the work, charging writers to create standards based on a set of conditions described in a document entitled The Conceptual Framework for Arts Learning. This presentation today will highlight the major concepts and organizing features of the new standards. But before we begin, I'd like to share a couple of facts. So the standards, while they were in process, were viewed by tens of thousands of people. The first set of standards that we released for public review included PK through 8 standards. And you can see that there were over 23,000 views for visual arts and 24,000 views for music. Then we released the high school standards and the model Cornerstone assessments. And again, there were tens of thousands of viewers of these standards along the way giving us feedback. Among these viewers, 6,000 people completed surveys, which gave us standard by standard feedback along the way. Next, this work is identified as national because the national organizations that make up the leadership team and the contribution of CDE representing the nation state by state through departments of education. These organizations provided the backing for the work, not the federal government. In other words, none of this work was supported by federal funds. This work is not the result of a federal mandate or a request from the U.S. Department of Education. The National Endowment for the Arts provided funding to engage 5 master artists, 1 for each of the arts disciplines, to provide feedback to the teams mid-course in the standards writing process. Other than that, no federal dollars were used in the writing of these standards. So they're really a national set of standards, not a federal initiative whatsoever. The reason they're called core art standards is that core is maintained in the title to remind people that the arts are a core academic subject in federal legislation. So yes, now I am talking about the federal government and federal legislation, specifically the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, currently known as No Child Left Behind. Many people do not realize that the arts are identified as a core academic subject under No Child Left Behind. Therefore, the term core in the title National Core Art Standards is a reference to arts as a core subject, not as a tie-in to the Common Core state standards. Something else that's important to remember is that the relationship then between national, state, and local in the context of writing standards. And this slide underscores that important relationship. Because our U.S. Constitution identifies education as a state's right, it is at the state level that the standards are actually adopted. Therefore, state boards of education or state legislatures make the final determination about state standards. Then, standards are put into practice at the local level, the local school district or the charter school classroom, by those teachers in the classroom. The new national art standards are being scrutinized by states currently, looking into refreshing their state art standards. The standards give them a model, but no state is required to adopt these standards. To date, both Arizona and Kentucky have adopted the National Core Art Standards as their state standards with little or no change. And other states, as I mentioned, are in various places along the way or looking in the future for when they might do that. So again, standards are sort of created at the national level, reviewed, vetted, rewritten, but at last adopted at the state level and enacted at the local level. We've got a little group chat we've inserted right now. So if you go to your chat option on your right-hand side of the screen, if you haven't moved that, that is a movable box as well. Here's a question for you. By participating in this webinar, what's something you've learned that you didn't already know about the National Core Art Standards? And the second part to that is, how has it changed the way you think about the new standards? And Lisa, these are coming into you, is that correct?
Yes. I don't see any answers yet. Looks like we have one person who's raised her. We have a couple people who have raised their hand. Erica says, I didn't know that core related to No Child Left Behind. Rebecca says, the word core. Katie, using the word core can be confusing when the Common Core is such a priority for schools. Tallery says, excited to know that here in Kentucky, the NCCAS are adopted already. Still thinking about how my thinking might change. Christina said, did not know about the large number of reviewers. And we've got, I'll let, one of our participants has raised her hand. Barbara, I'm going to unmute your microphone for you to say your response. Are you there, Barbara? It looks like you're on mute. We'll see if Barbara comes back later.
So let me jump in and say, yes, indeed, that word core, to use that word core in the title of these National Core Art Standards, as well as then making some assumptions that there's a relationship between these and the Common Core State Standards because they share that one word, and it's an important word, core. So the standards having been written over 3 years of time and identified early on, what are we going to call these things? We felt that identifying core in relation to No Child Left Behind, ESEA, and reminding people that core is a core subject academic subject in No Child Left Behind was kind of worth the trade-off. But it does depend on all of you to be able to share that with people when you talk about the National Core Art Standards. So that's part of that elevator speech as you go along and talk about these standards. And oh, did you know that core is, or that the arts are a core academic subject under No Child Left Behind, and that's why these standards are referred to as the National Core Art Standards, because the arts are core.
We also have Sandy, who said, I didn't know that only 2 states had officially adopted these standards so far. How much leeway do states have to change these standards before they lose the integrity or identity to the original?
That's a great question too, and that's where the CDA members, the State Education Agency Director of Arts Education from your state, and most states have someone who is designated to be in charge of arts, if you will, or follow arts policy or lead work at the state level that's related to the arts, where that CDA member oversees the committees and the groups that are part of the standards vetting and writing or review process at the state. And states have complete leeway. So if they didn't want to do this model at all, they don't have to. And yet they're being recognized and valued as a very strong set of standards, and as states begin to examine them, and the committees and the teachers, they begin to see the value in these standards. So it's really a initiative that grows state by state, but the CDA members are well versed in these standards. Great question. So Lisa, I think we should go on.
Okay.
Thanks, Lisa. The new core art standards identify artistic literacy as the overall outcome of an education in the arts. The conceptual framework identifies a set of philosophical foundations and lifelong goals for arts learning that form the basis for defining artistic literacy. As I've mentioned, the conceptual framework for arts learning is the narrative, descriptive document that provides context, definitions, and a rationale for the standards. It's available on the National Art Standards website. I'll show you how to access it in a bit, and your handout, which is loaded into the Citrix platform here, called the National Core Art Standards resource guide. We have 3 handouts up there. So that resource guide also shows you how to get to the conceptual framework for arts learning. It's brief, it's only 27 pages long, and it's loaded with good information. If you read one document related to the standards, this should be that one. This document may also be used as an advocacy tool. You'll find lots of gems sort of embedded in there as advocacy material. Any body of work in education these days needs to be backed up by research. The College Board provided much of the new and necessary research. Their research was created expressly to inform the standards development process and refreshes the research for the field of arts education, providing new insights into arts standards nationally and internationally. One interesting finding is that the overarching framework for the National Core Art Standards, the artistic process model, is used internationally in countries around the world. Therefore, these standards do not set a new pathway for arts instruction. Rather, they follow a trend already established by the global arts education community. All of the College Board studies are available on the National Art Standards website using the resources link, and you see that at the bottom of this page. But again, everything's provided in handouts for you. Now, on to the standards. I'll be using the simple visual organizer to highlight 3 foundational aspects of the new standards. First, I'd like to address the artistic process model. Artistic processes are regarded as the big buckets or main structural design behind the standards. The artistic processes for our purposes identified as creating, performing, responding, and connecting, are the way the brain and body make art and define the link between art making and the learner. Unlike the prior art standards of 1994, held together only by the binding of the printed book, truly, these standards are held together across arts disciplines through this artistic process model, creating a set of unified standards and unified goals which help students organize their learning and teachers organize their curriculum, lessons, and assessments. So the artistic processes are creating, conceiving and developing new artistic ideas and work, responding, understanding and evaluating how the arts convey meaning, connecting, relating artistic ideas and work with personal meaning and external context. And in this slide, because it's a slide I borrowed from the Educational Theater Association, we're looking at the word performing. However, I'll talk about how the P artistic process has 3 different definitions depending on which arts discipline you're in. So for theater and the performing arts, performing is realizing artistic ideas and work through interpretation and presentation. Something about creating and the 3 Ps. So creating is specifically about conceiving and developing works of art. In other words, the making of the art as director, choreographer, designer, producer, conductor, composer, painter. These 3 Ps, performing, presenting, or producing, is about the realizing, sharing, or presenting of the art or the doing of the art as the actor, dancer, curator, musician, technician. Connecting and responding. So connecting is relating artistic ideas and work with personal meaning and external context. It's significantly beyond arts integration or defining other subject matters through arts understanding. Connecting is really an internal process mechanism that synthesizes various bodies of knowledge for use in developing multiple entry points for personal expression. This is where we get to the personal expression of the arts. Responding, then, is a reflection on an external set of information. It's generally focused through comparison and critical analysis or critique. Using our visual organizer, let's now add the next layer, anchor standards. Anchor standards are shared among the 5 disciplines. Again, another unifying feature to these standards. They deconstruct the artistic processes and describe the actions required for each of the artistic processes. They provide meaningful cross-curricular linkages among and beyond the arts disciplines, and they help others understand what is required of each artistic discipline and how, in general terms, what's required to be successful in the arts. So often we hear, oh, arts, you teachers have the fun subjects, or aren't you lucky to be an arts teacher? Of which, yes, we are. But it's not magic what we do. It's really good teaching and good instruction and engagement with the artistic processing. This chart shows each artistic process with its definition there across the top portion of the page and the accompanying anchor standards on the bottom portion of the page. Please note here you can see the 3 definitions of performing, presenting, producing, and how closely and similar they are. What I learned through this process is that writing standards is an awful lot about negotiating language. And this was one place that we affectionately refer to as the 3 Ps, where the leadership team and the writing chairs held steadfast to the terms that they most identify with in relation to their particular arts discipline. So the performing arts gravitate to performing, the visual arts to presenting, and media arts producing. We tried very much to get everybody to agree to one of these words, and it's really okay that we're showing here the nuances within all of our arts disciplines, that we share a lot, but we're also unique in our own media, in our own art form. I think we're just fortunate that all of these words begin with a P. Finally, the performance standards. The performance standards are unique to each of the arts disciplines and translate the anchor standards into measurable goals that articulate student achievement. Now we can see how these three components of the National Core Art Standards fit together by design, like nested Russian dolls. Across these 5 disciplines, there are a lot of performance standards. These are written as developmental progressions, PK through grade 8 at grade level, PK 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then there's a conversion at high school away from grade level standards to an expression of achievement at 3 levels, proficient, accomplished, and advanced. Taking another view, starting at the top left-hand corner of your screen, you can see how we move from the 4 encompassing artistic processes to 11 anchor standards, then to discipline-specific performance standards. But that's not all we have in these new standards. This body of work also includes a set of discipline-specific instructional resources, which include enduring understandings and essential questions. If you're familiar with Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins' Understanding by Design curriculum development model, they use enduring understandings and essential questions, model Cornerstone assessments for assessing student learning against the standards, and something else we call process components, which are like power verbs. All of these elements are fully explained and described in that narrative document, A Conceptual Framework for Arts Learning. Here's another view. These additional resources then are here to assist teachers who enact the standards in the classroom and curriculum writers who use the standards to develop local curriculum. These resources function as a bridge to their teaching, curriculum, lessons, and assessments. They also provide a variety of entry points into the standards. If you organize your classrooms around EUs and EQs, here you go. You can modify these, you can add to them, you can refine them, you can use them as they are. If you want to begin with an assessment, we provide those models for you as well through the Model Cornerstone assessments. If you want to think about these standards from a student's point of view and identify power verbs or look-fors, you'll find those in the process components. So again, these instructional resources is a way to connect you with the standards. When we put this all together, our next screen will show you what that looks like in a scope and sequence. So let me point these out one at a time. This is a view, it's called Standards at a Glance. It's available on the website. We show you how to get there in the resource guide, as well as a few click-throughs on the PowerPoint for the website. So hang in here with me as I go through this. First of all, we know we're in the discipline of theater. It's up there at the top. Next, we're looking at the artistic process of creating, as well as Anchor Standard 1, generate and conceptualize artistic ideas and work. Now we move into theater-specific information with the enduring understanding and the essential questions. So for theater, this EU is theater artists rely on intuition, curiosity, and critical inquiry. The essential question that goes along with that is, what happens when theater artists use their imaginations and or learned theater skills while engaging in creative exploration and inquiry? And all of the performance standards underneath, as you can see laid out, PK, grade level up to grade 8, then at 3 proficiency levels in high school, proficient, accomplished, and advanced. All of these performance standards relate back to creating artistic process, Anchor Standard 1, and this EU and this EQ. Over here on the left-hand side, this is where you will find the process component or that power verb. This is what students really need to be able to do to be successful with this line of standards. And there we go. It's the scope, as I said, PK up through high school. And any of these terms that you see in red, they are glossary terms. Here's a snapshot of the first page of a theater model cornerstone assessment. These are supplied for all of the arts disciplines at grades 2, 5, and 8, and for each of the high school proficiency levels. You can also just download a template, one that's, all of these boxes are empty and you get to fill them in. These performance tasks, and that's what they are, performance tasks, are aligned to the standards and are provided as a tool for teachers to document student growth and outcomes. These tasks are intended to serve as models to guide the development of local assessments and illustrate how student learning may be assessed through rich performance tasks with clearly identified criteria. These elementary level assessment tools are currently being piloted, and the student work has recently, as of last week, undergone a benchmarking process. So what we hope to do from that benchmarking process is identify student work at proficiency or above, and demonstrate then, have that student work as benchmark or anchor papers or anchor student work to illustrate the expectations of the standards. And I want to thank the National Endowment for the Arts for supporting the benchmarking process and piloting the model cornerstone assessments. Then next year we'll do the same thing with the high school model cornerstone assessments. As I mentioned, these standards are available from the website. The handout that I keep talking about, the resource guide, takes you through some of the options available to you through this web-based set of standards. From the website, you're actually able to filter and sort based on your particular setting and context, based on your student needs and your local curriculum. So let me just run through a few brief highlights of the website. This is the home page, so this is what you see when you enter the web address and click into the site. The artistic processes now should be familiar to you, and they're at the forefront of the work and shown right up top. Then each of the artistic processes breaks down into the anchor standards underneath each of those icons for the artistic processes. And along the bottom, you'll see a set of, I think I have arrows. Here they are. Yes. Oh, let me go back to the first arrow. That is where you're going to find, click for the conceptual framework for arts learning. These are the artistic processes and the anchor standards underneath. And now with this last click and arrow, you'll see along the bottom a series of handbooks. Some of these are pre-selected, such as Standards at a Glance, which is that view that we looked at in theater. You can just look at the anchor standards. Another pre-selected handbook is a grade band view. And then you've got a handbook for those model cornerstone assessments, or a link that takes you to those assessments. Finally, the ribbon at the bottom of the page provides links to a series of resources offering several useful tools to support you and your work. And Sharon is now going to be taking us deeper into the section on inclusion, which is a most valuable contribution to the overall body of work and was supported by the Kennedy Center and VSA International. Sharon,
all right,
take it away.
Thank you, Marsha. Thanks. Okay, so this is moving into a slightly different topic, but it's all connected. Inclusion of students with disabilities in the standards was the focus of a team created through the offices of VSA and Accessibility at the Kennedy Center, as Marsha said. Our team consisted of leaders from around the country in each of the arts disciplines who are also highly knowledgeable in providing educational supports to students with disabilities. The slide indicates the team with 2 individuals for each of the arts disciplines. So how are students with disabilities included in the standards? Well, we first reviewed the standards during the writing process that Marsha has referred to. with particular attention paid to the wording of the standards to assure inclusiveness. For example, a standard might have indicated that the students will write a response to a lesson. Better wording is that students will demonstrate understanding of the lesson, as some students might not be writing but are still capable of understanding a particular concept and conveying that understanding in a communication mode that works best for them. So after reviewing the standards, after our team reviewed the standards during the 2 major review processes, we were better able to determine other needs that would be a benefit to arts teachers working with students with disabilities. So along with the language for each of the standards being inclusive, we also have a set of general guidelines and resources, and those are the guiding principles that I'll be talking about. And we have a separate resource list for each of the arts disciplines with an emphasis on universal design for learning. This is all on the website. And then we also have inclusion guidelines and differentiation strategies for each model Cornerstone assessment, again on the website. So the inclusion strategies are ways to broaden lessons to include a wide array of differences, and the differentiation strategies are more specific for particular characteristics. So on the home page of the National Core Arts Standards website, you will see the word inclusion at the bottom. When you click on it, you come to this page. Now this has a link to the guiding principles up at the top, and for each of the arts disciplines there is an introduction to including students with disabilities in that discipline. There's another arrow, and so for instance if you click on grade 2, you will see an introduction to including students with disabilities in that discipline at that grade level, a list of resources, and the inclusion and differentiation strategies for each of the model Cornerstone assessments. Okay, so this is the guiding principles document, and these overall guidelines provide art teachers with a foundation for working with students with disabilities in their classes. And to note, they are based on a thorough research of practices and policies in education. Well, why include students with disabilities? Well, taken together, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and ESEA, which Marcia mentioned earlier, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or No Child Left Behind, provide the basis for inclusion of all students with disabilities in general education, with high expectations for their achievement in high-quality education programs. Well, but who are students with disabilities? Well, first of all, they're a heterogeneous group. It's important to remember that their only commonality is the presence of a disabling condition that requires specialized supports to benefit from the general curriculum. And disability categories enable the determination of eligibility for services, and they inform the overall educational program planning and implementation, but the focus of teachers should be on individual characteristics and not so much on the label. Well, that said, here are the labels. This is so you know the 13 categories. This is basically a chart of the 13 categories that are identified under IDEA. Okay, so the most prevalent disability category is that of specific learning disability. As you can see, it encompasses 41% of all students identified with a disability. So again, this column of numbers are the percentages of students with that particular identification within the number of students who have an identification, a disability identification. So anyway, looking at specific learning disabilities, 41% of all students are identified with that disability. So, however, each student's specific learning disability is manifested uniquely, and educational supports require an understanding of each student's areas of need. So the same assertion applies to all of the other disability categories. Though teachers can have a broad understanding of a student's possible support needs based on disability category or label, knowledge of a student's unique characteristics and needs is essential for successful inclusion in the general education curriculum. And for full description of each disability category, you can see the Center for Parent Information and Resources Library, which is the parentcenterhub.org. And that resource and many others are listed in this Guiding Principles resource. So, all students should be challenged. Students with disabilities should be challenged to excel so that they are well prepared for successful post-secondary school education, careers, and lives in the community. Even if students are in elementary school, we are working towards those goals. It's never too late. So the responsibilities of all teachers, regardless of their content area expertise, is that they are required to teach students with disabilities. So according to guidelines by the Council of Chief State School Officers for licensing general and special education teachers, teachers must have core knowledge of their subject matter, right, as well as specific knowledge and skills from the field of special education. Now, what are arts teachers' responsibilities? Well, to deliver appropriate and meaningful instruction and assessments within the framework of the standards, the responsibility of arts teachers working with students with disabilities is that, first, they possess the core knowledge of a broad range of disabilities and how to implement general strategies and frameworks for inclusion, that they share and collaborate in evidence-based practices with the special educators and related personnel assigned to the students they teach. So collaboration with special ed and related personnel, special education teachers and related personnel is key. It's really important. That they know specific information about each student's abilities and disabilities, and they know and utilize the content of the individual education program, the IEP, including learning strengths and needs and goals and accommodations required for each student. You should be included in the IEP process, contributing to the content if you are an arts teacher. Also, create a positive learning environment inclusive of all students. And remember that arts teachers are not expected to work in isolation. You can best adhere to all of these when schools and districts support the achievement of all students, maintaining high expectations for all. So, there are 6 guiding principles for using the core arts standards with students with disabilities. The general framework for these is from the work of special educators responding to the Common Core standards, drawing on policies and current practices. These are described in detail in the Guiding Principles book with resources provided for each principle. And these are resources that you can find online. So they are: maintain high expectations, promote communicative competence, use the principles of universal design for learning, know how to select and use appropriate accommodations for individual students, make use of evidence-based practices, target instruction, and use formative indicators of student performance. So I'm going to go over each one just briefly. The first one, maintain high expectations. So high expectations should apply to all students regardless of ability or disability. I keep stressing that. If some are not achieving at expected levels, change the services, supports, and specialized instruction rather than lower expectations. In other words, design instruction and materials so that all students can fully interact with the content. And according to Martha Thurlow, when students with disabilities leave school, they should have the ability to use technology, understand a variety of perspectives, and communicate effectively. All teachers, regardless of discipline, contribute to the future of students with disabilities. So the second is promote communicative competence. Most students, regardless of severity of disabilities, possess a means to communicate. Communication is a foundational priority for all other educational activities. Think about it. Students should be able to express their needs, desires, questions, and comments about their lives and their world. Arts teachers should know, understand, and make full use of all students' communication supports effectively. Working collaboratively with special education and related service personnel can facilitate this process. And as you can see in the photograph, some students make use of augmentative and alternative communication devices, and working with speech and language pathologists and assistive technology specialists, arts teachers can learn how to work with their students using these devices. Okay, number 3 is use the principles of universal design for learning. Universal design for learning establishes a framework for creating learning environments in which all students can thrive. Designing instruction and assessment accessible for all will alleviate the need for most individual accommodations. So know there is a continuum of learning differences in the classroom and use the 3 guiding principles, which are on the next slide. And they are: represent information in multiple formats and media, and this encourages teachers to provide options for perception, language, and symbols, and comprehension in the transfer of learning. Provide multiple pathways for students' actions and expressions. So provide options for physical action, for expressive skills and fluency, and executive functions. And that's always pretty easy to do in arts education. Also, provide multiple ways to engage students' interests and motivation. Okay, so number 4 is know how to select and use appropriate accommodations for individual students. Some students with disabilities might require additional individualized approaches and supports. And so teachers should know how to select and use appropriate accommodations for individual students. These allow teachers to preserve instructional and assessment content, but alter the way in which students interact with the content. So the same set of accommodations should remain in place for both instruction and assessment. The IEP provides, stay back, I'm not finished with that one yet, thank you. Marcia's advancing the slides for me, thank you, Marcia. The IEP provides the format for addressing most accommodation for a student's general education needs. Accommodations are identified and developed by team members, and the arts teacher is often a member of the IEP team. So input from the arts teacher is essential because if you're not included, if the arts teacher is not included, the IEP accommodations list is not likely to identify specific arts-related educational needs requiring specialized material or environmental designs and/or assistive technology. Okay. So number 5, make use of evidence-based practices. Okay, so that sounds kind of daunting, but evidence-based practices are programs and practices demonstrated by research to positively affect student outcomes. Identified and adopted by one or more members of the IEP team, they can include specific strategies and interventions for individual students. Arts teachers should know and use the practices in place for their students. Okay? Such practices often involve a strategy to improve performance and simple data collection procedures and monitoring. It could be like a star chart. So the data collection procedures are usually really simple because all teachers are using them in the classroom. So don't let that keep you from using them. The benefits for implementing such strategies often outweigh the limitations. Okay, number 6, target instruction and use formative indicators of student performance. So this means that you are assessing continuously and scaffolding. So when you're scaffolding, arts teachers can monitor progress throughout teaching and constantly adjust based on student responses. Teachers can target specific areas of need and instruct based on those needs. In other words, teachers are being responsive to students in an ongoing exchange. And this is really important for students with disabilities. Okay, so considerations for students with extensive support needs. You might question the application of the guidelines to students with significant disabilities. However, the guidelines were written with students across a broad range of abilities in mind. Research related to instruction, however, provides evidence that students with extensive support needs can acquire skills and content knowledge in general education settings when provided appropriate supports and instruction. They can be responsive to both UDL-based adaptations and rigorous instruction when in general education settings, and they are best served when collaborative educational teams approach their education in general education settings with the intent of finding solutions to potential barriers to access and learning. Okay, and this is the last slide. The arts and students with disabilities. So we know from research, narratives, testimonies, and descriptions of successful projects and programs that students with disabilities benefit. And I'm sure many of you attending this webinar today know this. They benefit from well-designed, inclusive arts education, both academically and social-emotionally. Students with disabilities participating in the arts can exercise cognitive processes, find and develop their unique voices, and tell their stories. Sometimes the arts provide the only means of success and full expression for some students with disabilities. Responsive and proactive inclusion of students with disabilities in arts education is paramount to their overall well-being and future success. So with the guiding principles, the guidelines, in conjunction with those in the model Cornerstone assessment for each arts discipline, arts teachers can address the needs of students with disabilities in their classrooms in ways that are respectful of differences and fully inclusive. And that is it. Thank you.
All right, so we will open up to questions. I've had some people typing in questions as you've been presenting. Marjorie, in response to the chat that we did earlier, said, I too agree that there could be a problem with core versus Common Core, especially with states who have yet to adopt the art standards. Will there be places, websites, pamphlets, etc., that we can refer parents to when they ask?
Certainly, the National artsstandards.org website is the main website. Another website that we have is nccas.wikispaces.org. That was our workspace during the whole process of writing the standards, and there's a lot of information on that website. It's not pretty. Wiki sites are free, so we were working with a smaller budget as we could muster. So it's not a pretty site. It's not like the final National Art Standards website. I think too as well that the naming of these standards gets changed when they're adopted at the state level. So those Arizona standards aren't going to be called National Core Art Standards. They're going to be called, you know, Arizona State Curricular Framework for Arts Education or something like that. Kentucky is going to call them their own Kentucky Art Standards. So that word core will also go away probably as states begin to adopt these standards and brand them with their own titles.
All right, next question. This goes back a little bit to when you were going through your list of the responsibilities of arts teachers, Sharon. Who identified those criteria as the responsibilities of arts teachers? Christina would like to know.
Okay. Well, the guiding principles I wrote them, and these were based on, you know, I'd have to look back in the references, but I did quite a bit of research with the Chief Counsel for State, what is it? Marcia,
Council of Chief State School Officers.
Council of Chief State School Officers. Thank you. They provide guidelines for licensing teachers. So that was one, and there are several other references. It's national.
And the Council of Chief State School Officers is like the professional organization for commissioners of education, or some states call them their state superintendents, or their chief state school officer. So that's the organization that they do a lot of these guiding principles around a plethora of educational issues. So they also, of course, have a website, ccsso.org, if you want to go poke around their website. They've really also been instrumental in helping states roll out the Common Core State Standards.
Thank you. Susie would like to know, are there any visual arts core standards for high school, proficient, accomplished, advanced, or do they stop at grade 8?
The model converts between grade 8 and high school from that grade-by-grade progression of standards to high school standards that are expressed as performance standards that identify proficient, accomplished, or advanced. So let me talk a little bit about that. The reason that we convert to a different model at that place is it's based on the common delivery system across the United States. So when students go to high school, they may have one requirement or two requirements in the arts, and they often identify those as electives, or they get to select an art form. And you might have a junior in high school who finally adds arts to their schedule. They may have had lots of arts experience outside of school, and they come into this classroom as a junior, but they may really be advanced in their skill level. Or you could have a freshman who's advanced or accomplished in their skill level. Or you could have a senior who's proficient in their skill level. So we decided to lay the standards out in this other format at high school because of the delivery system and the variety of levels of experience students come with at high school. It's not to say they don't come with different levels at the elementary level, but so often students move in cohort groups from grade to grade. I hope that answers your question. So yes, they're there. They just are at these 3 proficiency levels.
Rebecca says, thank you for breaking down what can seem like an overwhelming document. Sandy says, I support the work of music teaching artists that work in inclusive school environments. One teaching artist shared that she is not sure how to teach the recorder to her students that cannot hold the instrument or make many sounds. She wants to include the student, but I'm not sure how to guide her to adapt her instruction appropriately. Do you have any tips or somewhere I can go to learn more?
Yes. I don't have a specific accommodation because I'd have to sort of be with the student and the recorder and so on. However, there are several people in music and special ed who do this work specifically. One person I'm thinking of is Kim McCord, and she has a book, and it might be listed in the guiding principles, I'm not sure. Actually, I think it might be, yes, I think it is. It's listed on the website where we have a list of resources for music educators. And her book is on, accommodations in music. And it's Kim McCord.
Thanks, Sharon. We had one of the other webinar participants, Walter, offered a suggestion. What about EWI for the recorder question? Electronic wind instruments can be set to play without the player blowing into the instrument. All you would have to do is change the finger positions. This might help.
Great.
Community help.
And that is how we get so many of solutions to so many of our working with students with their individual needs, is using our community to help us find solutions.
Right.
So I'm going to read this one out as our last question because we're just a little bit over 4 o'clock. This comes from Evelyn. Many high schools in our state still offer courses outside of the arts departments for fine art credit that are weak. Will the adoption of the standards affect this?
Oh, I'll take that one. That would be also an issue. I know Evelyn is from New Hampshire, but it's also an issue across the nation in other states as well. We try really hard at the state level to define what constitutes the arts. There is some monkeying around with that at the local level, and tracking that school by school is also a challenge. There is a difference state by state. Some states require high schools to approve each of their high school courses, and the state provides a list of course titles and course descriptions, and the high schools are only allowed to provide credit in those content areas based on those course descriptions and course codes. So as the State Education Agency Directors of Arts Education, we're really looking at providing all of our states with guidelines that then will be provided as guidelines to local schools and districts. So that's where the policy and the practice don't always fit together as envisioned. So how do all of us working together sort of track that and advocate for those changes to support arts education more specifically at the local level by identifying what does and what doesn't constitute credit in the arts at high school.
That was a good question. All right.
Always. They were all good questions, and I also want to thank people for submitting some questions ahead of time as well. And I know we didn't get to all of your questions. Some of them got answered either through the presentation or they were questions that were asked again here at the end. And some of those questions, when you filled out the registration form, become excellent prompts for Lisa to look at for other topics to provide these webinars with. Some of those were really big questions that you could spend a whole hour on. So I just wanted to thank everyone for submitting those questions ahead of time, and they did help guide us today as well.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon and Marcia. I think this has been, the overwhelming response that I've had from the participants has been that you've really helped them to break down, what seemed like an overwhelming, complex document into something much more digestible.
Excellent. I am so glad to hear that, because when you do have these, you sort of understand the conceptual framework, how the pieces fit together. You have some visual organizers to carry around in your head. You understand why they are called National Core Art Standards. Then all of you can help us bring these standards closer to the field, closer to students, where we really think they engage students and they do great service to the arts and great service to all students in our educational systems.
And with that, I'm going to wrap up today's webinar. So I'd like to ask you, our webinar participants, to stay on the webinar for a few minutes longer and complete a short evaluation survey that opens when you close the window. I read through what you write. I share it with our presenters. It helps us to give you the best possible webinar experience. And thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Sharon and Marcia. This was really great. I hope that it's a part one of perhaps a part two, a couple more. I think there's so much content for us to look at with this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for attending and being a part. I feel like I could feel people's vibes today.
You had, I think, an attentive audience. All right, so with that, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. You all have my email address, my phone number. I'll be sending out within the next week all of the follow-up materials, and I hope that we'll see you on next month's webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.